Welcome to Business Innovators Radio, featuring industry influencers and trendsetters sharing proven strategies to help you build a better life right now.
This is your host, Alicia Dubrow with Insight Media. And today I get to interview not only a veteran, but an experienced real estate agent that I have personally had the privilege to work with, Eric Seemann. Eric's knowledge and expertise of the San Antonio market helped my family and I find a home here in San Antonio, Texas. To give you a little bit of background about Mr. Seemann, he was commissioned as lieutenant in the United States Army in 1988. He was stationed in Schweinfurt, Germany, and deployed from Germany in support of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Now a licensed real estate agent with Keller Williams Heritage out of San Antonio, Eric spends his time working with and assisting both buyers and sellers in the real estate transactions. He's going to educate us on what a first-time home buyer needs to consider when buying their home. Eric goes into great detail on what to expect when looking for your first home, and with his experience, he's the definite go-to resource for any real estate transaction in the San Antonio market. Without further ado, I want to welcome Eric Seemann to the show. Hi, Eric, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alicia. I appreciate you taking the time to do this interview.
Oh, no, it was my pleasure. So, Eric, can you tell me a little bit about yourself for our listeners today?
Well, beyond what you already said, I guess you could say I'm not a native Texan. I'm originally from Northwest Ohio, but I ended up here after my first career, which was the Army, as you discussed. Worked in corporate America for a company called Clark American, now known as Harlan Clark, here in the San Antonio area. And from there, I moved on to work in the world of event management, helping plan trade shows and conferences until I find myself here in my fourth position as a realtor.
Nice. So can you tell me, what exactly does a real estate agent do? Like, what is the definition of a real estate agent?
Well, we really do a lot of things, but I can tell you, since I made the decision to get into this profession and change to this career, I've spent a great deal of time educating myself. There is so much that goes into being a real estate agent beyond just being a smiling face and a person who opens a door. We spend a tremendous amount of time in training, from our basic licensing classes to keeping up with the latest changes to the law, to financing changes, to technology changes. And there are just a lot that goes into keeping up with everything to be the full resource that we need to be to our clients. In fact, as a real estate agent, we work under a very strict code of ethics. And that code of ethics actually predates the structure that was set up in Texas for licensing by almost 40 years. That code of ethics breaks down into a very simple acronym that we refer to as OLDCAR.
And what does that stand for?
Well, OLDCAR is 6 core things that we owe to every one of our clients that we work with from a fiduciary responsibility. And that is obedience, loyalty, and disclosure is the old, and the CAR portion is confidentiality, accountability, and reasonable care and due diligence. It's very, very important for us to instill confidence in our clients, whether they're buying or selling, that they can trust us in all aspects of the transaction and with their personal information.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I would be the first testament to that. So now, does a real estate agent, so what is the exact role? So would you help somebody from what part to, from looking online, or do they look for a house and then they find a real estate agent, or how does that work?
Well, people get to you in different ways. Actually, as a real estate agent, one of our core jobs is what we refer to as lead generation. And you've got to be constantly out there trying to connect, trying to put your name out in front of the public so that you become the go-to resource, whether they're looking to buy or to sell. As an agent, and people will call off of a sign, still hard to believe in this day and age, but when you put a for sale sign in somebody's front yard, there's a phone number on there. And our office, because of the volume that we do at the Keller Williams Heritage office, we actually have somebody who's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, manning our telephones so that if someone who's searching on the other side of the world, maybe someone in the military who's going to be relocating from Japan back here to San Antonio, can call up and have reasonable confidence that someone's going to be on the other end of the phone to answer a call for them.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. So if I'm looking for a real estate agent, what are some different things that I should consider when deciding who to work with? Like, what are some things, some attributes I should look for in a real estate agent?
You know, there's a certain amount of it where it's just going to be that personalities that click. I can tell you before I got my real estate license, I absolutely believed or perceived a realtor as being a commodity person. When I made the decision to move to San Antonio 24 years ago, my company that I was relocating with, I asked who the number one real estate company in the city was. They gave me a name. I called the telephone, and that became my realtor. Worked with her through 3 transactions. But what gets somebody there, it's important for the public to know that they always have a choice. It doesn't have to be the first person you talk to. You should really do your due diligence, as any smart consumer would be doing, to determine what it is that they're looking for. There are people who are more comfortable with a man. There's people that are more comfortable with a female. There are people that are more comfortable with someone who speaks a different language. So there's different characteristics and different criteria beyond the professional. We're all supposed to do the same job in helping buyers or sellers through the contracting process. But a lot of it really comes down to the personality, communication style, and just clicking.
Okay. So, I mean, do I really need a real estate agent? Or, I mean, there's Craigslist, there's Zillow, there's Realtor.com. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can, find a house, look for a house, shop for a house. I mean, is a real estate agent really needed? And if so, why?
Well, those are great tools. From a professional standpoint, that's the way we look at all of those things that you just mentioned, whether it's Craigslist, whether it's Zillow, Realtor.com, Trulia. There's actually over 500 different apps and services and searches that are out there. But they really end up being just that. It's a tool. If you're interested in a house that you see on Realtor.com, you're going to need to talk to somebody to actually find out the specific details about that house, to find out about the neighborhood. The app does not allow you to go through the transaction of actually buying the house. As real estate agents representing the buyers and the sellers, we help facilitate the transaction and the communication. As with buying a house is like any other negotiation process, and negotiations can get pretty troublesome. And our job is to help smooth that, expedite the process, and help bring both the buyer and seller together to their mutual goal, which is the seller to sell and the buyer to buy and have a new home. And there is a lot that goes into that.
I bet there is, especially to make it a seamless process. I mean, I've recently experienced it, so I know it is. But so can you tell me, okay, so what kind of people do you help and how do you help them?
Well, as a realtor, I work with both buyers and sellers. And again, going back to that code of ethics, and we agree to and we actually raise our right hands and take an oath that we will work with all parties, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, financial ability, fairly and equally. You'll see a lot of those fair housing symbols, which is a little house with the equal sign on it. If you're a member of the National Association of Realtors, you would use that logo. If you're not, that's something that's trademarked. It's because the way we do business, and I happen to be a member of the National Association of Realtors, along with the Texas Association of Realtors and the local board. But when you get into that, the thing that really gets to it is opening the door and working with buyers. And you know the houses ahead of time that you're going to go into, and you're going to get those oohs and ahs and the wide eyes, to use a cliche, that deer in the headlight kind of look.
Right.
But it goes beyond that. And it is really, really fun to work with those first-time buyers through all of that.
Now, back on the point of first-time home buyers, what are some things, if I'm a first-time home buyer, what are some things I should think about before I even make the decision to buy my first home?
You know, just like working with a realtor is a personal decision, the best thing to do, and it's not common in today's world to sit down and take the time and make a list. But whether you do it on a piece of paper with a pen or do it on a tablet or put it somewhere, you need to sit down. Buyers need to go, what is it that I absolutely have to have? You know, if you watch any of your shows on HGTV, you'll hear the buyers talk about, well, it needs to be an open concept, and it needs to have this, and it needs to have this. And generally, it all focuses on the property and the property itself. And those things are important. But what about where the property sits in the city? How is it in relation to the commute and where you're going to be going to and from work or to and from your kid's school? Or in an emergency, what's it going to be like to try to get from your work to the kid's school near your house and then to, if situation would be bad enough, to a hospital? Are you familiar with, in San Antonio is Military City, USA. And my son, who's active duty Air Force, jokes about the fact that as jets fly over, that's the sound of freedom. Well, aside from the municipal airport, you have Randolph Air Force Base and Lackland Air Force Base and Fort Sam with its helicopters, and all of them can generate quite a bit of noise. Well, there's standard flight paths. Do you want to live under one of those flight paths if you do shift work? Those are all types of things that should go through your head and go through a buyer's head when they start to think about it, not just, does it have granite counters? Does it have stainless steel appliances?
And what do you think is the number one thing that somebody should be focused on before considering buying their first home?
Well, aside from all of those things, the biggest single thing that you have to consider is budget. When I start working and having conversations with someone who's going to be looking at buying, aside from what they're looking for in a house and the neighborhood, I immediately take them over and start talking to them about budget. And have they considered what they can afford? Have they looked into financing? You know, it's great and it's really easy to go out and look at and go, hey, we can afford this for a house. But then the reality sets in of everything that goes along with owning a house and what that mortgage payment is. It's amazing how fast a down payment adds up. Even a 3.5% down payment, which is available through certain types of financing. If you're looking at a couple $100,000 house, 3.5% down is $7,000 in the bank. And there's a lot of first-time home buyers that don't have $7,000 to put out. So it's making sure everything is set from a financing standpoint is the number one consideration.
And what are some financing options?
Well, there's a variety of things. Cash is always really nice, but that's a very, very small portion. Beyond that is what we would refer to as a conventional loan. Conventional loan are those loans where the buyer has the capability to put down somewhere between 5%, 10%. There's not an upper limit when you're working conventional, but it's typically within that 5 to 10% down range. After that, there's FHA loans, which are Federal Housing Administration. Just a minute ago, I said something about 3.5% loans. The Federal Housing Administration exists to help get buyers into homes. And through their financing and going through an FHA process, it's less cash to the table in order to be able to get you into a home buying position and out of being a renter. And then, of course, if you're a veteran, you qualify through the Veterans Administration for a VA loan. And there's also what's referred to as a USDA loan. And Yes, that is U.S. Department of Agriculture. And it is not necessarily just related to a big farm out in the middle of the Midwest. There's different pockets, even around San Antonio, just outside the metropolitan area, that qualify for USDA loans. And depending on income and ability to pay, if you qualify for a USDA loan, you can go in for no money down.
Wow. So as a first-time home buyer, like, are any of these loans more that you'd push them more in one direction or another? I mean, I know you're not a mortgage broker, but is there loans that are specifically for first-time home buyers?
I'd say the most common for first-time home buyers would be the FHA, because you don't have to have been in the military to qualify. It's available to the public at large, and it is the smallest potential money down at 3.5%. So that's generally where true first-time home buyers, and I say true, that'd be your young couples just getting started, going out and trying to buy their first home. There are some first-time home buyers. Matter of fact, I spoke with a client or a potential client tonight. Ex-military, 20-year career, but they've never actually bought a house.
Huh.
So it's not exactly the same situation as a young couple, 20-year-olds just out of college, thinking they're going to buy a house on their first jobs, but it still puts them in the position of being a first-time home buyer.
Okay. So what makes you so successful when working with first-time home buyers? I mean, as a realtor, why would a first-time home buyer want to work with you?
You know, one of the things that I try to emphasize whenever I meet with somebody is this is not my pace. This is your pace. And I'm willing to work with you as long as it takes to get you exactly what you want and what you're able to afford. I think there's a perception, and I have to say I think, that there's a percentage of the real estate agents that are out there just trying to sell and turn houses as fast as they can and are not as sensitive to the first-time buyers or to the buyer's desires. And from my standpoint, I'm here for the long haul, and long haul can be 3 months, could be 3 years. Sometimes it takes that long in nurturing a relationship to get everything in line to where the moment is finally right to be able to go out and buy a house. And when you work at that kind of pace, it makes it easier for the buyers to not feel like they're being pressured to make a decision. And there's enough pressure that goes into home buying. You don't need to have an agent who's pressuring you or you feel like is pressuring you on top of everything else that's going on in the transaction.
I would definitely agree with that. What are some different fees that somebody should consider with buying or using a real estate agent to buy their first home?
You know, everybody gets really concerned, and I guess fees. Whenever you say fees, the first thing that comes to mind is that as a real estate agent, I'm an independent contractor. I work for a brokerage, and in order for me to practice real estate in the state of Texas, I have to be sponsored by a broker and a brokerage. They have to be willing to sponsor my license. And in doing that, they take on a certain amount of risk in, number one, working with me. But number two is that every broker you work with has a different commission structure. And there it is. I've said the word. Commission is what everybody associates with fees.
That evil word.
Yeah. And I always present it with, okay, look, you do understand that I do this for a living. And at the end of all this, I hope to get paid. But when I'm working with buyers, I said, but when I work with buyers, understand that I'm negotiating myself a smaller paycheck as I try to get you the best deal possible for your new home. But beyond the commissions that the listing agent and the buying agent are going to be involved in, there are additional fees and there's some upfront costs. When you go into getting a loan itself, there will be what they refer to as origination fees. And in addition to whatever you would bring in for the down payment, you're going to be responsible for those loan origination fees. And depending on who you work with, type of loan that you're getting, those origination fees will vary. but it's a real cost and it's a real part of the expense of buying a home. When you work with a buyer, you go in and you get a house, and generally you accept the house in its as is when you sign the contract paperwork. But after you accept it as an as is, you then hire an inspector to come in and do an inspection on the home. And that inspection costs money. That's another dependent. Typically, those costs are based on the size and square footage of the home and what all needs to be inspected. Larger homes are going to cost more money, but that's $300, $400 there for that inspection. If you're concerned about wood destroying insects, termites, carpenter ants, you may need to add that as part of an inspection. If you're buying a house that has a built-in pool, guess what? You probably want to have the pool looked at by a professional before you make a commitment and find out you're buying a $10,000 or $20,000 expense that's going to need to be worked and resealed and cracked and that sort of thing. So there's just a lot of little things that can add up that are all part of the fees or expense into buying a house.
And those are all things that, most people just wouldn't know, just know by, because they don't have the knowledge and the education that a real estate agent has. So, which I would say definitely makes it well worthwhile to pay the commissions or the fees of what a real estate agent costs, because you could walk away from a transaction and end up with a big problem on your hand without having somebody educated by your side.
You could. There's that movie years ago, and I'm dating myself. It was Tom Hanks and Shelley Long in the movie called The Money Pit. And they bought this huge house, and it was just one thing after another, after another, after another. There's a real expense to owning a house. And it goes beyond the final closing and go, wow, I'm a homeowner now. Well, if you haven't been advised and walked through the process appropriately, you can find yourself as a new first-time home buyer with no cash left in the bank when all of a sudden 3 months down the line, something happens that was totally unexpected, but is a real cost of home ownership, and you need to be able to fix it.
Yes, no, definitely. So talk to me about neighborhoods. What are some important things if I'm buying my first home and I'm looking for a location? What are some different things I should consider when looking at neighborhoods?
Well, I'd say the biggest thing that outside of commute to work is if you're a young family and you've got kids involved, it's the schools in the school district. And it's very, very important. Every listing that goes through the multiple listing service, which we refer to as the MLS, lists the school district and typically should list what high school, middle school, and elementary school service that house. And you can go into the school district website, check out those specific schools, see what's going on. Matter of fact, as an agent, there's a form that I use that I send out to every one of my prospective buyers that has a list of every single school district in and around the San Antonio metropolitan area. And if that's not enough, because I work in some of the rural areas, I have a separate one that lists all of the rural school districts that are within the 8 counties that surround Bexar County, which is essentially San Antonio at this point. So schools would definitely be number one. Safety would be number 2. Not only do you want to know you're in good schools, you want to know in a place that may be a lower crime rate. And you can check that out through the local police. There's a couple of websites that I recommend to clients to go to say, take a look at this. You want to make sure you know that this is the right place you want to be. Right now, San Antonio is going through an annexation process. And as part of that annexation process, the commitment that San Antonio makes to any areas that are going to be annexed is that they will have accessibility to emergency services such as fire and police within 5 minutes of their house if they're annexed. And there's some rural areas, I live in one of them, where I could tell you when I first moved out here, I think the first 10 years I would have had to give directions to the police or sheriff to find my house.
Holy crap.
So those are all things that are important. And then down from there would be your groceries, accessibility to shopping, and maybe parks.
Okay. And now, is it important to see a neighborhood at different times of the day? For instance, maybe when schools, I would imagine it's, sometimes busier when, school's getting out or school's starting, especially if you're living close to one.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Honestly, if you're looking at and your agent's doing the service to you that they should, if you're looking at a house that's really in close proximity to one of the military bases or to one of the big high schools that obviously generate the most traffic because it's not only school buses, but it's all of the new first-time drivers that are pulling in with their cars. But it's important to see what that traffic flow is like at the end of the day or at the morning. If it's something that's going to affect your commute as you first leave your house because you're in a great neighborhood, but it's going to take you right by the high school, and in the morning you've got parents with freshmen who don't drive yet that dropping them off for some sort of sports practice. You've got sophomores, juniors, and seniors that are all driving. You've got school buses. You need to know because that can change your commute by 15, 20, 30 minutes in the morning. The other thing is, I've mentioned before, as I say, with the military bases, the military is the number one employer in the city of San Antonio. And because of that, between active duty service members and all of the government, civilian, and employees that support operations at the various military bases here, it's a huge flow of traffic. One of the other ones that I think is less common nowadays that I always look for is railroad tracks, because there are active railroad tracks that zigzag across the city, and these are not high-speed rails. These are low, slow freight trains that I've sat at some crossings and counted more than 100 individual train cars moving at about 15 miles an hour. You can imagine you're sitting there for quite a while.
It would definitely change your commute time. Okay, so how many homes should a new home buyer look for before making a decision? Like, is there a set amount that somebody should look at before making that decision, or what's your opinion on that?
I have to keep saying and going back to the fact that it's a personal thing. Now, I can tell you that there are agents who get a little bit more frustrated. You will have real estate agents who prefer to work with sellers because they don't have to worry about buyers and buyers' schedules and, oh, I just didn't like the position of the dog door, sort of comments. And there's agents who love working with buyers, and will open as many doors as it takes. I enjoy going into houses. It's one of those things that for the years before I had my license, it was always, you'd see a for sale sign in front of one particular house. You go, man, I wonder what that looks like on the inside. Well, guess what? Now I can go in. And if I can go in with the client, all the better, because then I can have them looking at it and seeing it with a different set of eyes, but getting all of that same kind of comments and feedback. So there isn't a set number. I've had a client who made a decision with one house. They had seen it online. They were absolutely convinced it was what they wanted. We looked at that one house, we put an offer in, and they got it taken care of. I've shown others as many as 40 houses.
So there's no set number. It just kind of depends on, and you got to make sure you're working with a real estate agent that has the patience if you are somebody who does need to do, see 20, 30 houses before making the decision. And
you know what? It's important. Earlier in the interview, you had asked a question about those things that are important. Be honest with the agent and the agents that you're potentially interviewing to work with, because you want to let them know it's like, hey, this is our first time and we want to look at a lot of houses. And you'll have agents that'll make a face just by hearing we want to look at a lot of houses. Honest communication between the agent to his clients and the clients to the agent is really, really important in this process. Cannot emphasize that enough.
So once a home buyer likes a house, what's next?
Well, that I think there's a misconception on that. People talk about, well, we're going to submit an offer. And an offer is more than just saying, okay, call them up and tell them we're going to give them $148,000 on their house they're listing for $160,000. Let's see what they say. It's way more than that. Some of that communication actually goes on, but the process of submitting an offer is actually a very formal process. And in Texas, the core document, which becomes the contract between the buyer and seller of a residential property that's a resale, is 9 pages long. And in that 9 pages, it asks, and there's things that you look at specifically about what the actual amount is that you're going to be making an offer on the house. How much of that offer is going to be financed? How much of it is going to be cash? It's specified whose the title office is going to be. It's requests that if a buyer needs a little bit more help on closing, are they going to ask the seller to cover some of that for them? In Texas, there's a thing that's referred to as a residential service company and a residential service policy. It's frequently referred to as a home warranty. But the new home builders who actually can issue a home warranty because no one has lived in the house before, when you buy a pre-owned home, that's referred to as a residential service policy. And it covers things from the dishwasher breaking down to a plumbing pipe that needs to be fixed. Maybe there's a problem with the water heater that happens in your first year. Typically in the process, the buyer will ask for the seller to pay for 1 year's coverage under a residential service policy. And all of those things need to be outlined and filled in on the contract. It needs to be reviewed, and then the bottom of every one of those pages needs to be initialed by the buyers and their signatures on the last page. Before that's considered a formal and a complete offer. And that's just the core document. If there's going to be financing involved, there's another document that says, we're going to be financing this, and this is how much we're financing. That needs to be signed by the buyers as they submit the offer. Since there's going to be financing, typical and appropriate to have a pre-qualification letter from the lender to substantiate that they actually have the ability to borrow the money and make an offer that they're making. And it could go on from there. If there's a septic system, there's another form that says, hey, there's a septic system, you need to be aware of it. If the house was built before 1978, it's required by federal law to notify the buyers that there could potentially be lead paint still in the house. All of those documents need to be signed and completed and filled out to be considered a full and complete offer. It's not just, hey, tell them we'll give them $200,000.
Okay, so what about inspections, appraisals, walkthroughs? Is that all done in the initial offer, or does that happen after?
Well, if you're going to put an offer in on a house, you've probably walked through it. Now, that doesn't always happen, but at least you've had a chance to preview it. You've looked at it in photographs and that sort of thing. Texas real estate contracts have a unique portion in them which is referred to as the option period. And the option period allows the buyer for a certain amount of consideration, that would be dollars, to pay directly to the seller of the home the right to have 10 days to look things over, to hire an inspector, to bring them in, to climb up on the roof, to climb under the foundation if you need to get into the walls, to check all of the outlets. That option period allows the buyer 10, 12 days, whatever number of days that they paid for, to really look over the house with a fine-tooth comb. At the end of that time, they can decide whether they want to move ahead with the transaction or if they want to walk away. The option period gives the buyer the unrestricted right to terminate the contract for any reason. But it's during that 10 to 12 day period that typically all of those inspections would take place. The appraisal is a separate process. the buyer hires the inspector, the lender hires the appraisal and the appraiser. Now, with the appraiser coming in, that's another fee that could have to be paid for up front by the buyer. There are a few appraisers who will allow it to be paid at the closing, so it's not dollars out of their hand right up front. But one of the things to remember in that is you're going through and you're doing these inspections. All of that is money out of the buyer's hands. Before they've agreed to finally move ahead with the contract, it's during that option period. So while I say you're walking away, you paid $100 for 10 days, and at the end of 10 days, you decide to walk away. Well, if you did your inspections during that time frame, you've also paid $400, $500, maybe even up to $1,000 with a septic inspection and clean out to have and know that the house is in good shape. And if you walk away from it, you don't get that money back for having those inspections done.
But if you decide to stay in the transaction, you'll be very glad that those things were done ahead of time.
Absolutely, because once you get all those inspections done, one of the next things that goes on in the process is an amendment for repairs. And an amendment for repairs is very, very standard in a transaction. I can tell you, I've sold brand new houses and I've sold houses that are historic in nature. And every single one of them has an area of the house that is not going to pass inspection. And inspectors required to go through as they go through a house, and if there's been a code change since the water heater was installed. This is a common one that's happening in San Antonio right now, is there was a code change on water heater configuration. Every single home inspector is going to tell you, well, this doesn't meet code. Doesn't mean that your water heater is not operating perfectly fine. It just means that it's not up to current code. Now, you could go ahead and say, hey, we want the water heater fixed and brought up to code. But if it's not broken, you don't have to fix it. When I go through an inspection with my buyers, I tell them we look at it three ways. First one is safety issues. If there's something going on with an electrical, with a smoke detector system, things that actually have a potential to be very, very dangerous if they assumed or took over the house without having it repaired, those are things that we're going to address in this repairs amendment. The next set of things is going to be, they're going to tell you if there's some stuff that's structurally wrong. But at the same time, if you're going through this with a lender, that lender appraiser is going to come out and they're going to tell you too that there's something wrong, and they're only going to lend if these things are taken care of. So there's a certain amount of safety first, structural issues, and then the last one, as I just referred to, the rest of it is going to be your first honey-do list. And yes, I look at the husbands.
Okay, so let's just say everybody is in agreement. You know, the buyers and sellers, and everybody says, okay, well, you know, they've done the inspection, they've done the appraisals. You know, the lenders, everybody's in agreement. The closing's next. Now, can you explain to me what is a closing, and how would I know what to do if this is my first time buying a home?
Well, closing is the actual process where everything you've agreed to in writing comes to fruition. And it's not one of those things, it's not like a major contract negotiation if you ever were in business or saw those movies where the parties are sitting across from each other and there's one book and they all put their signature at the bottom of one page. The closing process is generally handled through the title office and an escrow officer. And the escrow officer is the person who has received the earnest money you put down on a contract and has prepared and researched the entire house to make sure that, number one, the sellers have the right to sell what they're saying they do, and to make sure that the buyers have full and complete title and ownership of the property when it's all done. Depending on financing, depending on how the house is being purchased, dependent on the lender and dependent on the title company, that number of documents that a buyer or seller could take care of that day, they could be assigning their signature to 20 or 30 different forms, sometimes maybe even more. And that seems really, really daunting. But one of the things that happened with the Dodd-Frank Act that was began initiation in 2007, the final piece that was put in place was a truth in lending time frame that was built into the process. And this requires that the title office provide a final summary 3 days out from the closing date so that the buyer can have one more chance to look at it and go, oh my gosh, I don't have this. Or, oh my gosh, I wasn't aware I was going to have to pay this. During that final review process, this is where you get everything worked out so that you can go through and you can close on the house. Closing is a traditional term. With this new regulation that went into place, the real term now is supposed to be consummation, and the consummation is bringing the buyers and the sellers together to complete the transaction. Hopefully, at the end of the day, the buyers walk out with a set of keys, and the sellers walk out with a check for the proceeds they make for the sale of their house.
So that's handled by a title company, not the real estate agent.
Correct. Typically, the real estate agent is going to be there, and I'll say, for lack of better terminology, hold everybody's hand, okay. Especially in the case of buyers if it's their first time through. But it is a title officer and an escrow officer professional who are going through those documents. These are people who are not only professionals from a title standpoint, but also from a notary standpoint, reviewing all of the documents. Some title officers will do 5 transactions a day. So they're used to seeing the forms. They can easily break down a 10-page form and explain it to you in a couple of minutes. But one of the things that you need to, that buyers need to remember, I think, they have a chance to stop and ask as many questions as they want to during the process. If there's something they see on a form that they have a question about, ask the question. Don't just sign your name and move on to the next one. Because you're going to get a file of all of those 30, 40, 50 forms that you signed. At the end, you're going to take it home, you're going to file it, and you're never going to look at it again unless something happens, and then you're not going to know where to look. So it's better to know up front while you're going through the closing process. Ask the questions, make sure you understand what you're signing.
Just don't rush through the process.
Correct.
Okay. So now that we've gone from, what kind of financing, what should somebody look for, how many neighborhoods, the entire process all the way to the closing table. Tell me, in your opinion, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see a new home buyer or a first-time home buyer making when they're buying their home?
I really think the first-time home buyers underestimate the cost involved with buying a home. Having been on both sides of the transaction before, there's kids that are out looking, and I use the term kids because of my age at this point, that are out looking for a house that really are in no position at this point to try to be buying a house. And not only are they going to have trouble ultimately when the loan is through and they're trying to make their payments, but they're going to put themselves in a position of what I refer to as being house rich and cash poor. Because lenders and what a lender looks for and what they're going to allow you to borrow does not necessarily take into account all the things that go into the expense of the house and the expense of the process. We've touched on several of them during this interview. We talked about the cost of home inspections. We talked about the cost of the pest inspection. Talked about the fact that there's this earnest money that goes in. And the earnest money is going to be applied to you at the closing. But if you have to put $1,000 or $1,500, write a check out of your checking account the day you sign that contract, all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, now I can't buy my groceries.
Yeah.
And it's those people that are in that position that really are not doing themselves a favor by buying a house that on paper they can afford, but the reality is that now they're going to have to eat white bread and peanut butter for dinner because the groceries can't be bought this week. Or we're stuck driving the same car that's falling apart and we can't buy new tires because we have too much invested in the house. If the agent's doing their job, the real estate agent representing those buyers should be advising them to go, understand you can, doesn't mean you should. Let's take a look at this.
Okay. So would that be your biggest piece of advice for somebody that's just starting out?
It is. As much as I emphasize budget, once you know what you can spend, just because you have an upper limit doesn't mean you always have to try to reach that. It's not the goal to go, hey, I can borrow $275,000. Let's buy $275,000. And then you actually look a little bit above that, figuring, oh, I can negotiate it down and put you at the very top end of that. So, yeah, I really think that agents who just look at that number and don't advise their clients to go, take a look at your whole budget. Where are you at on cars? What are the age of your cars? Because a mortgage company is not going to know or care. They're not going to ask the specifics on how old your car is. If they see that there's no car payment, great, no car payment, you can buy more house. Your car could be on its last legs.
True. Okay. So what do you think is one of the biggest myths or misconceptions that people have when they're buying a home?
I have to go back. Well, our office shows it on TV all the time, but we have HGTV running all the time. There's a plus and a minus with HGTV. Number one is that it's really made people more aware of those features. There's things that I think anybody who watches HGTV or DIY or the Learning Channel, Discovery Channel, any of their home buying, home renovation programs that they see on TV, it helps make them a more educated buyer. But at the same time, it's raised the bar so high on what can be done that I think there's a lot of first-time home buyers that expect every single house they walk into to have $40,000 worth of appliances and granite counters and an island that you could seat a family of 15 around. What the yard looks like. As I say, it just is such a myth as to what a house is. If you're in a budget range of looking at a $150,000 house, then you're not going to have a 3,000 square foot house.
True. Okay. Well, and it's a really good way to put it in perspective. And it does, there's some positives, but there's also some, negatives to watching HGTV and then all of a sudden thinking that, you know everything. So, okay, so if somebody in the San Antonio market, either they wanted to buy or sell, or maybe it's a first-time home buyer and they wanted to get in contact with you, how would they go about doing that?
Well, Alicia, the easiest thing to do is to reach me by phone. I carry a mobile phone. To say that my phone is on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, probably not an exaggeration on it functioning, but I'm answering it late into the night, early in the morning. That number is 210-389-6324. That takes you directly to my voicemail. And if for some reason I don't pick up, you will absolutely hear my voice and recognize that you've got the right person. Additionally, I've got my own webpage, which is under victorsgrouptx.com. That's VICTORSGROUPTX.com. That's my domain. That's what I use for the extension on my email, which is eric@victorsgrouptx.com. You can find me through the Keller Williams or Keller Williams San Antonio websites, which is kw.com or kwsanantonio.com. And, of course, I'm on a multitude of social media. My Facebook page is Victor's Group of Keller Williams Heritage, and I have a Twitter account, LinkedIn account, and Instagram account, which are all as Eric V. Seemann.
Great. And you spell your last name with 2 E's and 2 N's, correct?
Correct. It's German in origin, Seemann.
Okay. Well, Eric, I want to say that I truly enjoyed this interview. You have tons of valuable information that anybody, either buying their first home or maybe their second or third home in San Antonio needs to hear. It was really, really educational. I really want to thank you for not only the valuable information, but for, really helping my family and I move here to San Antonio. You made it a seamless process. I really appreciate it.
Well, it was great working with you and your family. I'm glad I was able to help.
Oh, no, we definitely appreciate it. We love our house. It was great. It was great. All right, guys. This is your host, Alicia DeBrell from Insight Media. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Business Innovators Radio. To hear all episodes featuring leading industry influencers and trendsetters, visit us online at businessinnovatorsradio.com today.